Hey, this is Kaz, and welcome back to Nightmares at Midnight.
Do I look abominable to you?
We all go a little mad sometimes.
I see dead people.
He's alive!
Congratulations, you are still alive.
What's the boogeyman?
As a matter of fact, it was.
Well, whatever you do, don't fall asleep.
I'm your number one fan. There is nothing to worry about.
You're gonna be just fine. I'll take good care of you.
I'm your number one fan.
Okay, welcome back to Nightmares at Midnight. I am feeling a lot better, thankfully. Last week's episode was kind of hard to get through because I could barely breathe through my face. So it was really nice to start feeling better. This week's episode, we're going to do a little bit of chatting in the beginning. I'll roll the dice, we'll figure out what state we're doing and get right at it. Before I jump into everything, I have to talk about Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/Nightmares at Midnight podcast, you'll see our Patreon. When I just went to Patreon on its own and searched for us, you couldn't find us as easy, but if you go straight to our direct one, it'll be right there. We have 5 options. There is what we call Bedtime by 8 p.m., which is where you pay $3 per month and get an individual thank you and a shout out on the first episode of the month after your donation. There's Bedtime by 10 p.m., where you pay $6 per month, where you get a shout out email, a shout out on the first episode, and a once a month live chat with me. We have the third group, which is Bedtime at Midnight, where you pay $12 a month. You get a shout out, you have the once a month live chat with me, exclusive content, and behind the scenes on how we make the podcast. We have Do You Even Sleep, which is where you pay $24 a month and get a shout out on the podcast, a once a month live chat, behind the scenes content, the ability to request a topic that was read individually and sent to just you. So basically, you pick something that you want me to do the research on. I read and do a podcast just for you. Lastly, we have Yep, You're a Vampire, where you pay $48 a month and you receive a shout out email to just you, a shout out on the podcast, a once a month live chat, a handwritten thank you, a to be determined handmade gift, and the ability to request the topic that was read individually and sent to just you. So if you go into Patreon and you sign up for one of those, there's a bunch of benefits. Don't forget, you can tune in to listen to us at Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Apple Podcast, Podcast Index, TuneIn Plus Alexa, Podcast Addict, Podchaser, Deezer, and iHeartRadio, or on our website at nightmaresatmidnightpodcast.buzzsprout.com. So if you go directly just to our website, you can see the full list of all of the episodes. Each little episode kind of has a little blurb about what the episode's going to be about as well. And don't forget to email us your ideas at nightmaresatmidnightpodcast@gmail.com. So many of you razz me about that little spiel that I do sometimes in the beginning, which is why I've been trying to avoid doing it. But I just have to, so that way you're knowing about that it's even there. My spiel's done. Let's figure out what state we're going to do. I'm going to roll the dice and figure it out. Here we go. Okay, today we're going to do Connecticut. I've done some research for Connecticut. We're going to cover Melon heads. We're going to cover the Warren Occult Museum, and probably finish it up with the Jewett City vampires. I don't want to throw too much information at you. Last time I did like 6 cryptids, and I feel like I just threw a lot at you. So we're going to do the 3 topics this time. It kind of covers a bunch of information in there. And then we'll get feedback from you and see if you prefer the longer episodes with more information or the little bit shorter episodes with just a little bit less information. Just let me know what you would prefer, because I can come up with a bunch of cryptids and spooky stories pretty much for every state. So I just don't want to give you too much where you're just not even involved anymore. So, Connecticut. Let's see. Pretty much every New England town can claim a ghost, and many have a witch in their past, but the Melonheads belong to only a handful of places in southwestern Connecticut. The Melonheads live on the outskirts of town on heavily wooded country roads known as Melonhead Roads. Zion Hill Road, for example, is Milford, Connecticut's Melonhead Road. Sawmill City Road is Shelton, Connecticut. The Melonheads also supposedly live on the outskirts of Monroe, Stratford, Seymour, Weston, Easton, Oxford, Southbury, Fairfield, New Haven, and Trumbull. Try and tell me they're not real when they are supposedly existing in all those different towns. They look like small humanoids with oversized heads, and they rarely come out from hiding. They survive by eating small animals, stray cats, and human flesh, usually the flesh of teenagers. Sounds like a spooky story. And for runaway teenagers or hikers who disappear, the Melonheads serve as kind of the convenient explanation of where they went. Stories about deformed country people who keep to themselves go back at least a century to Europe. For example, a large family of Melonheads supposedly once lived in Bavaria, Germany in the mid-19th century. An inbred family of Melonheads, known as Weebleheads then, were said to live outside Risbury, England around 1900. According to another theory, the term Melonhead may stem from Melungian, which describes mixed-race people in Appalachia. They had an ancestry of European outcasts, freed slaves, and Native Americans, and they kept to themselves. Melonhead stories surfaced in Connecticut after World War II, a time when people moved away from cities into the suburbs. But how did the Melonheads end up in Connecticut? One theory claims that they came from a family accused of witchcraft and banished into the wilderness, where they survived and inbred. Through centuries of inbreeding, they mutated into Melonheads. Melonheads allegedly prey upon humans who wander into their territory. According to another theory, which I read, the Melonheads escaped from Fairfield Hills Hospital, a now abandoned mental institution, or Garner Correctional Institute, which specializes in inmates with mental health problems. Both are in Newton, Connecticut. A variation on that theme has the Melonheads escaping from an unnamed mental hospital in the 1960s that burned down. That resulted in the death of all of the staff and most of the patients, with 10 to 20 inmates unaccounted for, supposedly having survived and escaped to the woods. The legend states that the Melonheads' appearances is the result of them having resorted to cannibalism in order to survive the harsh winters of the region, and to inbreeding, which in turn caused them to develop hydrocephalus. Because I didn't know what hydrocephalus was, I looked it up, and it's a condition in which an accumulation of CSF, or cerebrospinal fluid, occurs within the brain. This typically causes increased pressure inside the skull, and in babies, it may be seen as a rapid increase in head size. Some of these legends have retellings, like the one with the asylum or prison, with places of business or campgrounds, and the inmates or the patients with employees, staff, or campgoers. Individual variations will modify what town these individuals were originally from and where they end up. Similar Melonhead stories also surface in Ohio and Michigan. An evil Dr. Crow supposedly conducted experiments on orphans in Kirtland, Ohio. Just in case you were unaware, this part of Ohio used to be a part of Connecticut before there was all the separate states. So after the U.S. was established, a portion of northern Ohio was designated as the Western Reserve. A section of the Western Reserve, including Kirtland, was given to the state of Connecticut after the Revolutionary War. Fun little history fact for you. Anyways, these children escaped and burned down the orphanage and retreated into the woods. In Michigan, the Melonheads were children with the hydrocephalus that were abused in an insane asylum in Ottawa County and eventually released into the woods. So this part, while I was reading it, gave me goosebumps, and this is a common story that I've discovered while researching melon heads. According to legend, back in the 1980s, a group of girls from Notre Dame High School in Fairfield decided to drive around after a Friday night football game. They piled into a blue Granada, and every story I read is this blue Granada, and ended up on Velvet Street in Trumbull, which is one of the towns I mentioned earlier, where they looked for the melon heads. The girls parked the car, leaving the headlights on, and ventured into the woods, which is so stupid. After they'd walked a couple hundred feet, they heard the car door slam. Then the engine started and the car headed toward them. They could see figures inside, the size of children. They had large heads, rags for clothes, and an orange glow in their eyes. Some say the melon heads still drive around in that blue Granada, because it was never found again. Other, less detailed stories describe mysterious figures in the woods. Workers who paved Sawmill City Road in Shelton, another one of the towns I mentioned earlier, claimed they heard voices in the woods. Tree experts checking the woods for fungal infestation thought they saw strange figures lurking in the underbrush. The legend of the melon heads isn't the only one to involve deformed or mutated humans. Connecticut also has the Danbury Frog people, which I mentioned last episode, and the faceless people of Monroe. Want to look for them yourself? I've got a list of melonhead roads in southwestern Connecticut. I have to tell you, if I go to Connecticut, I'm probably going to check this out, but this is all the way across the country for me right now, so hopefully when we get back into the lower 48, we can maybe take a road trip up there. So, there's Edmonds Road in Oxford, Velvet Street in Trumbull and Monroe, there's Zion Hill Road in Milford, the roads around Lake Mohegan in Fairfield, Marginal Road in New Haven, Jeremy Swamp Road in Southbury, and paths or roads in and around Roosevelt Forest in Stratford. A number of Connecticut-based legends of the melon heads have one characteristic in common: the inclusion of a secluded, rustic, or single-lane dirt road running through Melon Head's wooded territory. Many towns in Fairfield County and New Haven County have rural and forested sections, and it is not uncommon for these forests to have rural roads running through them. These roads at times are associated with a local variation of the Melonhead legend and are said to be part of the Melonheads' territory. Characteristics of the legends evolve, and parts of various versions of the legend affect other parts of the legend. For example, some legends claim that Melonheads would bite or consume whoever entered their territory. Also, the Melonheads' territory commonly involves a secluded rustic road. There is one instance where elements of the legend interact over time, and why some actual streets are mistakenly referred to as Dracula Drive by some locals because of the biting the people that come into it. Ooh, I just saw the connection between Melonheads and vampires later in the episode. Awesome. That was unintentional. Stories about deformed country people who keep to themselves are common legend. While the legend of the Melonheads is more widely told throughout southwest Connecticut, one of several other similar legends of deformed or mutated humans can be found in various locations of Fairfield and New Haven. These legends have been told in overlapping communities where some individuals would tell versions of one legend alongside other individuals who would tell versions of another legend. So I think that these Melonhead people very well could be something to do with the asylums that they escaped from. I think that's a probable story, because people held in insane asylums suffered really harsh conditions and brutal treatment that was more likely to worsen their condition than improve it. Since people knew little about goings on in these prisons and treatment facilities, they often resorted to wild and extreme speculation that inspired a genre of urban legends. These stories were the precursors of modern-day horror and haunted house stories. Because how many institutions do you know that you could list that have these similar stories where the inmates escape, or the inmates, kill the staff and then escape? I mean, it's pretty common. People were also curious about individuals with inherited and acquired deformities and shared stories about them that reflected ignorance about the causes of various conditions. So, I hadn't heard of the word hydrocephalus before researching. So, I didn't even know that was a thing that can happen. So, I can only imagine that people, back in the 1900s even had any idea that was a thing yet. So, Real or not? I think this one could be real because of, like I said, mental health was treated in the 60s wrong and how people can just be rural people. One explanation is that it reflects the fear and prejudice of urban and suburban people towards rural and isolated people who may have different lifestyles or appearances. So when I mentioned, I think last episode it was, where I was talking about how kind of uncivilized people lived out in the woods, that could be this same concept. This is especially true for the post-World War II era, when many people moved from cities to suburbs and encountered unfamiliar cultures and environments. The Melonhead legend may also serve as a scapegoat or a warning for social deviance or misbehavior. So this one could be being made up so teenagers stay out of the woods. A second explanation is that it is influenced by other sources of popular culture or media that feature similar themes or characters. So, for example, there are many horror movies, books, and games that depict deformed or monstrous creatures that live in secluded places and attack unsuspecting victims. Some examples are The Hills Have Eyes, which I mentioned last episode, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Wrong Turn, Resident Evil, and Silent Hill. These sources may have inspired or reinforced the Melonhead legend among some audiences. Like, I probably hadn't heard of Melonheads until I had watched some of those. Actually, I've seen all of those, which we'll talk about Silent Hill later on when we get to that state for sure. One example of a hoax about Melonheads is a video that's posted on YouTube in 2011 by a user named the Melonhead Hunter. The video shows a group of teenagers driving around Felt Mansion in Michigan at night looking for melonheads. They encounter one hiding behind a tree and chase it with their car until it runs away into the woods. The video has over 300,000 views and many comments from viewers who either believe it or doubt it. However, the video was later revealed to be a fake by another user named the Melonhead Hunter Exposed. The user posted another video showing how he made a melonhead mask out of paper mache and wore it while his friends filmed him running around Felt Mansion. He also explained his motives for making the hoax. He wanted to make fun of people who believe in melonheads and show how easy it is to fool them. You know, right now, especially with all of like the capability of video editing and AI stuff, I feel like it's super easy to make these movies, these videos that look like they were, filmed on a phone or whatever. And that's really causing issues with people who do believe in that stuff because it's spreading word that stuff like this is a hoax. And I'm one for a good dark humor joke, but I just don't think messing around a haunted area or a institution that's kind of got that reputation is a smart idea. Like I don't know that I would do that, and I don't know that I would suggest anybody else do that, whether you believe in it or not. While researching, I looked up movies about melonheads, and one that I don't think I can bring myself to watch is Legend of the Melonhead's House of Crow. So remember earlier I mentioned Dr. Crow and how he was in the part of Ohio that used to be Connecticut. Well, this movie is kind of based off of that. It involves the sinister Dr. Crow. Looking up books, I thankfully only got children's books in response about a character named Adam Melon. I can only imagine if Stephen King got his hands on a Melonhead thought process, that book would be terrifying. I would read it, but terrifying. So what do you think? Do you think that they're real? Do you think that they're just these people with hydrocephalus? Or do you think that they are these inbred people that escaped from an asylum 100 years ago and have just continued to live out in the woods? Let me know what you think. I think that they are. Some version of them at least are out there. We're going to jump to the Warren Occult Museum. I bring this one up because it's located in Monroe, Connecticut, behind Ed and Lorraine Warren's house. In case you don't know who they are, they founded the New England Society for Psychic Research in 1952. They are also the inspiration for the Amityville Haunting movie, as well as The Conjuring. I feel like if you listen to my podcast, chances are you've probably seen some of the movies that I just mentioned. They handled cases of hauntings and possession, and they collected trinkets along the way that they believed were touched by evil. They locked them in cases in the museum to keep them safe from the public or to keep the public safe. Ed has since passed on, but Lorraine and their son, Tony, keep it maintained now. The eccentric collection contains an alleged vampire's coffin, a child's tombstone that was used as a satanic altar, death curses, demon masks, psychic photographs, and they also have their most prevalent item, the cursed Raggedy Ann doll, which was Annabelle, and it was said to have killed a man. She has her own clear case, backlit by a haunting red light. While looking up research, I was curious as to why in the movie Annabelle she looks different than a Raggedy Ann doll and more of like a creepy looking puppet. Apparently, to avoid copyright infringements, they had to change her appearance for the movie. Zach Bagans, in case you don't know who that is the host of Ghost Adventures. He went to the museum and claimed something happened to his car after meeting Annabelle, but Tony, the son, is quoted saying Zach was putting on an act for the camera. Tony says the problem is it doesn't have to happen right away. The devil doesn't have to do what you want it to do. It may happen a year from now and you won't attribute it to the doll. They're sly, they're cunning, and they hate you, referencing coming into contact with the evil trinkets. Allegedly, the Annabelle doll had escaped from the museum, which Tony also quickly debunked, stating that they have heavy security at the museum to prove innocence of their trinkets and the people that visit them. He said the doll never left her case. So definitely if I take a road trip to Connecticut, I'm going to check this place out. Apparently, when I was reading about if we can visit it or not, it's kind of confusing because it kind of seems like it's closed, but some people say it's still open. Apparently it seems like it's in the back of a garage rather than an actual like storefront, but I would really like to be able to just check it out, see what kind of vibes you get from the place, you know? Like I understand most places kind of decorate their place up to look like Halloween or to look really spooky, but I would like to check it out and see what it actually is like. When I was reading the reviews, it said that you definitely get the, evil vibes when you walk in. Moving on, old psychiatric hospitals can be terrifying places. In the past, society didn't have the kindest methods of dealing with people suffering from mental illness. Thus, enters the Norwich State Hospital, which was located in Norwich, Connecticut. Many of those treatments are now considered outdated, like lobotomies and electric shock therapy. Those were everyday occurrences then. Sorry to interrupt this, but I just realized that Yeti's swing was clicking in the background. I have her in here in the pod lab with me. I got that to stop, so hopefully you won't be able to notice it in the background as much. Okay, picking back up. We are talking about the treatments that are now considered outdated, like lobotomies and electric shock therapy. As a result, it isn't uncommon for mental hospitals to be the subject of rumors or ghosts and spirits. If you believe in the paranormal, places that institutionalized the mentally ill for decades seems likely to be haunted, and Connecticut is not immune to such rumors. In October 1904, when the hospital first opened, it held 95 patients and was a single building. The facility quickly outgrew its small beginnings, and by fall of 1905, it held 151 patients and had expanded its housing by adding 2 additional buildings. The original building was then converted to administrative offices. In 1907, a third patient building was opened, and over the next 8 years, there would be the addition of 13 structures to the grounds. So this place is huge. The hospital began to branch out, no longer creating housing intended for only patients, but for hospital physicians, a laboratory, an employees club, a main kitchen, and various other structures to support the everyday workings of the hospital. Like most mental hospitals at the time, it was self-sufficient. A barn, 2 garages, a paint shop, and a greenhouse were also added. By the end of the 1930s, over 20 buildings had been added to the grounds. The fact that it just closed its doors in 1996 makes me a little uncomfortable as to what could have still been happening to the patients at that point. I feel like electric shock therapy and lobotomies should have been done a long time ago. Due to the large number of structures, and the hundreds of acres they stood on, the majority of buildings were connected by a series of underground passageways. The main purpose of these tunnels were for the utilities. However, they were often used to transport patients from one area to another. This is giving me horror flick vibes all the way. In the mid-2000s, the tunnels became a means of transportation for trespassers who hoped to explore the grounds of the hospital undetected by the security officers who have been hired by the state to patrol the vacant site. That makes me feel weird that they have to have security officers there at this place that's been closed for years. Many people believe that the grounds are haunted, mostly due to the unfortunate Norwich State Hospital deaths that plagued the facility. First a suicide, then a water heater explosion, a car accident, and a number of patients dying during treatment. Could this be the place of tortured souls? Paranormal investigators reported a great deal of ghostly activity throughout the facility, particularly in these tunnels. The television series Ghost Hunters visited in 2010. The show portrayed mysteriously moving objects and floating orbs. Over the years, all the buildings associated with the Norwich State Hospital have been demolished. Not much stands nowadays, and there is little to commemorate the history of this important spot. So I don't know how I feel about haunted places or haunted hospitals, that type of thing. As someone who has previously worked in a hospital, I do believe that souls kind of stay around sometimes because weird stuff would happen. But I feel like this one specifically or other previous, state hospitals or institutions, I feel like that energy just has to stay there because of all the bad things that they were going through at that time era. Like the lobotomies and stuff like that. I feel like that negative energy has to have stayed there. Okay, so I don't cover vampires very much. I don't think I have at all, actually. But while I was covering Connecticut, I discovered the Jewett city vampires. And I had heard the story of them previously on Morbid. That was one of them that they covered. And I have previously heard stories about these specific ones before. And similar stories about why they thought they were vampires. So we're going to go ahead and dig deeper and talk about what I found. In Griswold, Connecticut in 1990, 2 children were playing near a hillside gravel mine and found some graves. One ran home to tell his mom, who was skeptical at first, until the boy produced a skull. Police initially thought that the burials might be the work of a local serial killer named Michael Ross that was popular at the time, and they taped off the area as a crime scene. But the brown, decaying bones turned out to be more than a century old. The Connecticut state archaeologist Nick Bellantoni, we talk about him a lot, he determined that the hillside contained a colonial-era farm cemetery. New England is full of such unmarked family plots, and the 29 burials that were found were typical of the 1700s and early 1800s. The dead, many of them children, were laid to rest in thrifty Yankee style, is what it's called, in simple wood coffins without jewelry or even much clothing, their arms resting by their sides or crossed over their chests. So about the Jewett family, these are who we're talking about that we found. In the first half of the 19th century, Henry and Lucy Ray of Jewett City had a comfortably sized family of 5 children who all grew up and survived the many natural perils and hardships of childhood that were present in colonial America. Over the course of a period of time that spanned the late 1840s to early 1850s, Henry and 2 of his adult sons, Lemuel and Elisha, died of a peculiar wasting away disease. Then, in 1854, a third son, Henry Nelson Ray, was struck by this strange disease, which today would have been identified as, any guesses? Tuberculosis, but which back then was clearly the work of a vampire. The family exhumed the bodies of Lemuel and Elisha and burned them right there in the graveyard. The family reunion made the newspapers, and the Ray family is known today as the Jewett City Vampires. So basically, while I was listening to Morbid about this, they explained that really what was happening was the family was thinking that one person got sick, the first one, and then he died, and came back as this vampire and took the next family member and converted him into a vampire, and he died. And so then there was 2 vampires, and they just continuously went after the family, when really it's because they didn't understand the science of tuberculosis happening yet, and that it was an actual sickness that they didn't know that they were fighting. The Ray family plot can be found toward the northern end of the small graveyard known as the Jewett City Cemetery in a borough of the town of Griswold. A line of headstones, all bearing the 3-letter surname, now mark both the final resting places of most of the family as well as the site of the bonfire. You can follow the timeline of events by the years on the gravestones, although Henry Nelson Ray's stone is not in the family plot. There's a gravestone with his name on it at the other side of the cemetery with the death date of 1854, which kind of alludes to the possibility that the vampire hunt may not have worked after all. So they thought that he was originally a vampire and was infecting the rest of the family. Back to present day here. Scraping away soil with flat-edged shovels and then brushes and bamboo picks, the archaeologist that we talked about earlier, Nick, and his team worked through several feet of earth before reaching the top of the crypt. When Bell and Tony lifted the first of the large flat rocks that formed the roof, he uncovered the remains of a red painted coffin and a pair of skeletal feet. They lay, he remembers, in, quote, perfect anatomical position. But when he raised the next stone, Bell and Tony saw that the rest of the individual had been completely rearranged. The skeleton had been beheaded, skull and thigh bones rested atop the ribs and vertebrae. Quote, it looked like skull and crossbones motif. He's never seen anything like it, he says. After a lot of analysis of the bones, it showed that the beheading, along with the other injuries, which included rib fractures, occurred roughly 5 years after the death. Somebody had also smashed the coffin. The other skeletons on the gravel hillside were packaged for reburial, but not JB, as the 50-ish male skeleton from the 1830s came to be called, because of the initials spelled out in brass tacks on his coffin lid. He was shipped to the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Washington, D.C. for further study. Meanwhile, Nick started networking. He invited archaeologists and historians to tour the excavation, soliciting theories. Simple vandalism seemed unlikely, as did robbery because of the lack of valuables at the site. Finally, one colleague asked him, have you ever heard of the Jewett City vampires? In 1854, in neighboring Jewett City, Connecticut, townspeople had exhumed several corpses suspected to be vampires that were risen from their graves to kill the living. A few newspaper accounts of these events actually survived. In the course of his kind of out there research, Nick placed a phone call to Michael Bell. Now, Michael Bell's a Rhode Island folklorist, and he's kind of notorious for being kind of out there. He had devoted much of the previous decade to studying other New England vampires that had been dug up. The Griswold case occurred at roughly the same time as the other incidences that Bell had investigated. And the setting was right. The city of Griswold was rural, bordering southern Rhode Island, where multiple exhumations had occurred. Many of the other, quote, vampires, like JB, had been grotesquely tampered with and reburied. In light of the tales Bell told of violated corpses, even the rib fractures began to make sense. JB's accusers had likely rummaged around in his chest cavity, hoping to remove, and perhaps to burn, his heart. Vampires have gone from a source of fear to a source of entertainment, Bell says. Maybe I shouldn't trivialize entertainment, but to me it's not anywhere as interesting as what really happened. Bell's daughter, 37-year-old Jillian, a member of the audience one of the nights Bell did a lecture, has made futile attempts to tempt her father with the Twilight series, but there's Buffy, and then there's Twilight, and then there's what Michael Bell does. As far as he's concerned, the undead are always with us. He has documented about 80 exhumations, reaching as far back as the late 1700s and as far west as Minnesota. But most are concentrated in backwoods New England in the 1800s, startlingly later than the obvious local analog, the Salem, Massachusetts witch hunts of the 1690s. Hundreds more cases await discovery, he believes. Quote, you read in an article that describes an exhumation, and they'll describe a similar thing that happened at a nearby town, says Bell, whose book, Food for the Dead on the Trail of New England's Vampires, is seen as the last word on the subject, though he has lately found so many new cases that there's a second book on the way. The ones that get recorded, and he actually finds them, are just the tip of the iceberg. Almost 2 decades after JB's grave was discovered, it remains the only intact archaeological clue to the fear that swept the region. Most of the graves are lost to time, and even in the cases where they aren't, unnecessary exhumations are frowned on by the locals. Bell mostly hunts for handwritten records in town hall basements, consults tombstones and old cemetery maps, traces obscure genealogies, and interviews descendants. He says, as a folklorist, I'm interested in recurring patterns in communication and ritual, as well as the stories that accompany these rituals. He says, I'm interested in how this stuff is learned and carried on and how its meaning changes from group to group and over time. In part because the events were relatively recent, evidence of historic vampires isn't as scarce as one might imagine. City newspaper reporters dished about the horrible superstition on front pages, though scholars today will still struggle to explain the vampire panics. A key detail unites them. The public hysteria almost invariably occurred in the midst of savage tuberculosis outbreaks. Indeed, the medical museum's test ultimately revealed that JB had suffered from tuberculosis as well, or a lung disease very like it. Typically, a rural family contracted the wasting away illness, and even though they often received the standard medical diagnosis, the survivors blamed early victims as vampires, responsible for preying upon family members who fell sick. Often, an exhumation was called for to stop the vampire's predations. So, do I believe that there's vampires? Although I would love to become one and live forever, I don't know that I necessarily believe that there's blood-sucking vampires converting other vampires. That one's hard for me to actually believe truth in. But let me tell you, if they're out there and you're listening to my podcast, feel free to make me immortal too, please. That would be great. But anyways, I think I'll wrap up the episode here. It was a little bit delayed this week, but that's all right. We're just going to try and get one episode out a week to start with while we get back into the swing of things. Next week, we'll be back and see what state we get then. Thanks for listening, and as always, catch us next time.